All right. That doesn't. We're going to be. You can use any. You can use any version of Angular as long as it's past 1.1. Yes. Okay, so because we've downloaded some files, we're going to have to. Because we've downloaded files, we're going to have to change our source code so we can reference those files. So in your gist directory, those files that you downloaded, you should have Angular UI router. I'm sorry, you can't. Can you see that? It's tiny. Angular UI router, Angular min, and bootstrap.css. So inside of our gist file, inside of our gist folder, you can see I'm inside our gist folder. No tricks over here. There we go. Inside of there, let's create a directory that we'll call lib. And take all those files that you downloaded and copy them into that lib directory. Okay? Okay?
Yes.
All right, cool. And then we'll be using UI router. Okay. And then the first, we're going to change two lines in our index.html. The first line that we're going to change is this script tag, and this script tag, instead of this, we're just going to reference that file in the lib directory. That's on line 6. Okay. Okay, and then the second thing that we're going to change is on line 16. We're just going to delete the whole CDN thing and change that to lib to reference that.
So just make sure that the file name and the path match the file structure. Right?
Yeah.
Like if, for instance, if you didn't have a minified version, right, you might just have bootstrap.css instead of bootstrap.min.css. Or if you didn't place it in the lib directory, then you may or may not want to prefix it with lib, right? So just make sure that it matches exactly what you have on your file system.
Okay, if your index.html does not match my index.html, raise your hand. Or if you haven't touched your index.html. So we have the two lines that we're going to change are line 6. So we're referencing bootstrap.min.css or bootstrap.css, depending which one you have. Right here, we're going to change that to the match the file structure that you created for yourself. I stored all my library files in the lib folder. And we're going to do the same thing with the angular.min.js or angular.js. Okay? Okay. So make sure that works and go back to your web browser, go back to Chrome and refresh the page and make sure you don't see any errors inside of here. One way that you can check on that, by the way, is if you click on, are you guys using Chrome? If you're not using Chrome, you should be using Chrome. So go get Chrome. If you are using Chrome, you can open up this web developer console either by going to, I believe it's View, Developer, and click on View, click on Developer Tools, or alternatively, you can hold down the Option, the Command button, and hit I.
Is anybody having any errors or any trouble? Yeah, if you can't find the .map, that's not a big problem.
Yeah, we don't, the map file's for error handling later. If you don't have a .map file, that's okay. .map files are, okay. So if the only error that you're seeing is that it's not finding your .map file, that's okay. Oh, I have an error.
Yeah, you want to click on console.
.map, yep.
Development tools, and just as long as there's no errors. Yeah, you wanted to see a blank page.
Yeah, if you see this error is okay. It's just saying it can't find your .map file, and like that doesn't matter. That's it's trivial. Okay, cool. So before we went on our break, we wrote our Angular module, right? That was the first thing that we did. The second thing that we need to do is we need to tell Angular to bootstrap our web app. The way that we bootstrap our web app is, does anyone remember how we bootstrap our app?
Included in the HTML tag.
Yes, we need to include our script. We need to include our script.js, or in this case, our app.js in index.html. We've done that right here. And then we have to tell Angular to bootstrap our app. We did that with a special attribute. Does anyone remember what that attribute is? ng-app, right. So we can bootstrap our app on any DOM element in our page. This is important because if your company is building an app that is not an Angular app, if it's a backbone app or using straight jQuery or any other JavaScript framework, or not even using a JavaScript framework, you can embed Angular inside of other web applications. So if at any point, let's say, if you want to give control, you want to build an Angular app for just one component of your app, you can do that simply by, instead of putting your ng-app attribute on a top-level DOM element, like the body tag or the HTML tag, you can do it simply by putting that ng-app tag on a different part of the page. You can put it on any DOM element. Of course, it would be kind of weird if you had an ng-app on a button, but you can if you wanted to. So if you're doing anything, if your company is doing something that is not, or you or your company, or if how you get paid during the day is not using Angular, you can introduce Angular into that page if you want to. Because we are building an Angular application right now, I'm just going to put this on the body tag. So the ng-app directive looks like that, right? If we're doing just the ng-app directive like this, we're going to end up building on a default application, and that default application, we won't have any control over that. Because we are building an application, we want to tell this ng-app. We want to tell the Angular to bootstrap our specific application. So if we go back to our app.js file, we are creating an application, or we are creating an Angular module called myapp. Like this. If you called it something else, that is cool too. Just make sure that the exact same name that's inside of our module description, like this, is the matches the string that we pass ng-app itself, just like that. Remember before when we were talking about DOM elements, pretending to be methods? This might look something like this. Okay, after you've done that, refresh your page and make sure there's no errors. If you do get an error, let's say that you mistyped this guy and you refresh the page, you might see something that looks like that. That's a really ugly error, but all this error means is that it can't find the module called myapp. So just make sure that you type in the exact same thing, and that error will go away. Okay, let's all take a really quick breath here and relish in the fact that we just wrote our first Angular app. Okay, cool. All right, are we ready to get back trucking? Someone say yes. Yes. Awesome. That was more than someone. That was some people. Okay. Cool. So we already invoked. What? Make sure that this name, whatever you pass in here, matches this.
And that you're saving that as app.js.
Oh yeah, this needs to be app.js, and also make sure that you have this second argument there. It's just an empty array for the time being. Okay, and we've already invoked our application. Huzzah! Oh, and look at that. That looks familiar. I just typed that out in a comment. Cool. Okay. So let's talk about data binding. So an application is, our application right now, it doesn't do anything. It just sits there as a blank screen and doesn't throw any errors. Which is pretty awesome, right? Probably want it to do something though. One impressive thing in Angular is this data binding concept. And that, when I say data binding, what I mean is binding some data to the page. Right. So the way that we bind data to the page is we use this scope object. So the scope object is just a plain old JavaScript object. We can interact with it like any other JavaScript object. We can add data to it. We can add methods to it. We can interact with it. We can reference itself inside of there. It's just a JavaScript object. So for instance, if we wanted to add a user object in our page, we could do it with something like this. If we want to add a name to it, we can do it like that. We can do it like that. I should probably point when I say that. Or we can also add a function to it. Like I said, it's just a plain old JavaScript object. It's just a JavaScript object. We can treat it just like a JavaScript object. It's nothing special. It's just a JavaScript object. Are you guys less scared of the scope? Cool. Were you scared of scope in the beginning? I don't know if I should have taken a poll. Who was afraid of scope? It's okay. You can raise your hand. Okay. Thank you. But it's just a JavaScript. Yeah, it's just a Pojo. Sorry, it's just a plain old JavaScript object. Pojo. Okay. I thought that was clever. I liked it, the red. Okay. It's actually magenta, but. Okay, so how do we get access to this scope object? This scary $sign scope object? Well, in order to get access to the scary $sign scope object, we have to interact with it through a controller. You can kind of think about it if you know the MVC idiom or the MVC design pattern. Scope is kind of like the model to a controller. So we make a controller by using the surprise controller function on our module. I should mention that sometimes I leave out this module right here. Every time that we create an Angular object, we're going to be writing it on that module. So if you don't see it there, we're just going to be adding it to this guy right here. Cool. So the controller object itself, the controller method takes two arguments. The first one is the name of the controller. In this case, we're creating a home controller. Excuse me, tea breath. We're creating a home controller. The first argument is the name, home controller, and the second is the constructor function for that controller. So every single time that Angular says, hey, I need the home controller, it's going to run that function that we pass as a second argument. It's going to run that function. The argument, we'll pass it an argument $scope. It has to be named $scope. We'll see why in a few minutes. And then we can do whatever we want with that $scope object. We can add a name to it. We can add an object to it. We can add a function, etc. So let's go create a controller. We're going to create a home controller on our application. And even though the answer was just given away about 60 seconds ago, how do I create a controller? I'm gonna actually start asking specific people. Okay, girl in the yellow. Is that yellow? How do I create a controller? And what's your name first? Win? Cool, I like your name. I used to have a mini named Winnie. That reminds me of Winnie, my mini. Okay, how do we create a controller, Win?
Dot controller.
Yep.
And I'm going to give assign a name to the controller.
Yep, so we're going to create a home controller.
Give a callback function.
It's not actually a callback function. It's a constructor function. Well, it's important to know the difference. A constructor function is called, even though you probably know this, I'm just going to repeat it so everyone can hear it. A constructor function is a function that gets called to create an object in the running browser. So this is a constructor function. And that constructor function, we're going to pass it one argument, and that argument is going to be called scope. So there we go. So everyone create your home controller. Thank you, Win. Okay, so on the scope of our home controller, we're going to add a name to it, just to make sure that our application is actually functioning the way that we expect it to. So since we're in here, let's go ahead and add a name to that scope object, and in this case, we'll just all put Ari in there. Oh no, actually, let's say Ari is awesome. If you're so inclined, you can also change Ari to your name, but I insist. Okay. So the way that we attach this controller to our page, because remember what we're doing is we're declaring our interactivity in our HTML. So we need to tell our HTML where this controller goes. The way we do that is by using another special attribute called ngController. Just like that. The reason why we have to give our controller a name is because we need to be able to reference that controller on the page. The way that we do that is by passing that ngController attribute an argument, and that argument is the controller name. Let's go do that in our page. We'll come to our index.html, and we'll just add our home controller for the time being, just on this div, on this container. Okay, does everyone have that? And then let's just, because we attached a data variable on top of our scope called name, let's make sure that that name shows up when we reload our application. The way that we can do that is by binding it using data binding, using Angular's data binding to the page. So I put here an h1 element. Inside here, let's just say hello to that name. These binding tags right here, these are template tags. If you've ever used mustache before, then you're familiar with that syntax. If you haven't used mustache before, don't worry, you're using that syntax right now. It's not actually mustache, just so you know, but that's the syntax. They're very, yes?
Do you need spaces on either end?
You do not need spaces. I like spaces. If you don't want spaces, you don't have to. In fact, you can even bind using a couple other methods, but we're going to cover that later.
Is there a difference between putting ng-app on the body or like the HTML tag?
Yep, there is a difference. Do you know what the difference is?
I'm guessing the scope is instead of the body, it's like the whole.
Yep.
HTML.
Yeah, so right now, if we wanted to do anything interactive in our head, we couldn't. So for instance, if you wanted to load a custom CSS file in the head of the file, you couldn't do that. I don't know why you'd want to do that. Maybe you want to change the title. That might be a case where you would, but you don't have to do it in there. You can do it in, there's other ways to manipulate the title. I particularly like it on the body. Sometimes it's necessary on the head.
There's been a lot of examples that have it in
Yeah. In this case, we're just putting it on the body. It will still control effectively the entire page because the browser doesn't render the head. It's kind of mean. Okay. Does everyone have this? Everyone bound their name to, even though it's not really a name because it says Ari is awesome, on all of our computers. If we come back to our application, we refresh the page, you should see something like that. It says Ari is awesome. Hello, Ari is awesome. Does that not work? Does this work for everybody? Wait, I should ask that in inverse because that is going to cause problems. If this isn't working for you, raise your hand and Nate will come around and help.
So you don't want to end, your Angular module should not have a semicolon. Can you see the right way to trip up?
Oh,
Because you're
yeah.
calling .controller on the return value of Angular.module.
Right. So what Nate is saying is if you put a semicolon like this, then JavaScript's not going to be able to parse because it thinks that that's the end of your sentence. It thinks that's the end of it. But since we're not ending it there, we're adding a function call to that object that gets returned by Angular module. If you have that there, it won't work. If you don't like that, you can also do this. Where you can say that your app is like this, and you can just call it directly on your app, just like that.
Anyone else still having trouble?
Okay. Oh, look. It said hello, Ari, because my name was Ari. That's okay. Okay, so that's great. We can bind data to the page. Is yours working yet?
I've had my files were a problem.
Okay.
Still fixing.
Okay, Nate will come by and help. You probably pay attention here, and then when Nate comes by and helps, he'll help. Okay, cool. So how do we add interaction to our page? Like, that's great that we can bind data, but what if we want to have, when you click a button, you want something to appear and show and hide and zoom and 3D animate and make you coffee or tea, because I'm a tea drinker. Tea. Okay, so we can, as I said before, the scope object is a, the scope is a, you guys are all right. Yeah, it's a Pojo. All right, the back row this time. The scope object is a, no, it's just the back row. just the back row this time, because no one in there said it, or I didn't hear it. Back row this time. The scope object is a, yeah, okay. So because it's a Pojo, we can just write a function to it, right? So in this case, in this demo, we're writing a function called say, and that say function takes a single argument, and that's it's message. JavaScript isn't a typed language, so you can name that whatever you want and pass in whatever you want. In this case, we're going to pass in a string. And when we run this function, we're going to say hello, or whatever that message is to the whatever the name object is. In this, you can see that here we are referencing the scope itself in that function. Cool. So the way that we attach this action to the page is we use the ngClick attribute, the special little attribute, and we put that on any DOM element. In this case, we're attaching that ngClick to a button, and then we're inside of the string of that ngClick, we are referencing on that scope object the name of the method, and we're saying, the name of the method, and then we're passing in a single argument. In this case, we're passing in hello. Okay. That looks something like this. Hooray, look, a button. If we click on it, you can see that I get an alert because that's how we defined the function. Cool, let's do that now. Okay, let's just go add a say function here, or let's just make it say hello because it'll be a little bit easier. That won't work. There, that will work. Okay, just so you guys know, we will be getting into more complex examples later. I insist, even though it looks trivial, that you type this out, because if you don't type it out now, later when we get to more complex things, you'll be like, well, how do I do that again? That's why these examples that we're running through right now are relatively simple. So if you, please follow along. I insist. Yes?
I use the keyword this instead of scope when you're referencing name.
You can, but not the way we've set up. We'll look at that. In fact, I will show you how to do that after we do this example. Because that's how I type my controllers also. And it's considered good practice. You'll see why. Okay, does everyone have their function defined? It can be a trivial function. It can just console log, whatever you want. Please, I insist that you actually do type this out. Cool, so second person in the second to back row with the PC. Yes, you. Is that a PC? No, that's a Mac. Yeah. Hi. What's your name?
Chen.
Chen? Chen, that's Win. Have you met Win?
No.
Okay, well, that's Win. I will play name games with you because I'm terrible at them. So, Ched? Chen? Chen. Why did I call you Ched? That's weird. Sorry. Okay, so do you remember how to add interactivity? How do we call that function on our page?
Yeah, ng.
Yep, so let's do that on a button. Okay, and what was it again?
Ng click.
You gotta spell click right. Okay, and then what do we pass into that click?
Say hello.
Is that it? We need to, so Angular itself is going to parse this. So in order to tell Angular that this is actually a function, we have to pass in, we have to say, hey Angular, this is a function and you're going to call it when you click. The way you do that is you pass in the parentheses like it's going to call it. Like it's going to run it. Okay? Does everyone have that? Move it up. All right, when you're done, when you've attached that button to the page, go back and refresh your page. Whoops, refresh your Angular app. Oh, wait, I think I added that as an example. Okay, refresh your Angular page and you should see, hello, Ari is awesome, unless of course you deleted it. If you deleted it, then you won't see that. If you click on this say hello button, you should have an alert that says hello, Ari is awesome. It should say just like that. Hello, Ari is awesome. Or hello, Chen is awesome. Okay. So the question was just asked, can we say this instead of scope? I'm going to answer that question right now. For the purposes of simplicity, we're not going to use this syntax we're not going to use this syntax in our application, although we might forget and use it anyway. However, if you want to use this syntax, you totally can. The way that you can do that is that in this ng controller function, you can pass in home controller as, and then pass it some name like this. You can pass it control, or we'll just call it C for the time being. And we can say, here, we have to actually reference that controller. We can't just say name anymore, just like that.
So this is good for nesting.
This is good for nesting. This is good to be explicit. So in here, if we do that, we no longer need to attach this to scope. We can simply just say this.
And you say this is best. This is better practice then?
It's a good practice, yeah. There is some, just clue you into the Angular controversy-ish. Did I just say that? Ish. Okay. I'm like a housewife in the OC. Oh man, I shouldn't have said that, should I? Right. Okay. There's some controversy in that. Some people think scope is more explicit, and some people think this is more explicit and thinner. So it's really neither here nor there. You can use either one. I personally use this over $scope. When we actually get into building the meat of our application, you can play around with it as well. Right. Okay. One more thing that we can do that I forgot that I wanted to show you guys is inside of this function, we can also manipulate the scope itself as well. So let's say that we want to change, when we say the scope, we want to change the name. Let's say, Chen, is that how you spell your name?
Yes.
Awesome. So when we click the Say Hello button, we're going to change the name of the variable that we've defined on our scope from Ari is awesome to Chen. Oh, let's be fair. Chen is awesome. So we come back and refresh our page, and we have hello, Ari is awesome inside of there. Although this is a mislabeled button, if we click on this button, then it will change that from hello, Ari is awesome to hello, Chen is awesome. Because we simply changed the variable on the scope. Notice we didn't reference the DOM at all. We didn't define how this interactivity happens. We didn't write, the only JavaScript that we wrote was we interacted with the plain old JavaScript object. We didn't think about the DOM when we wrote this, did we? If you thought about the DOM, stop. In the name of the... Hey, I got more eyes that time. Right. Okay. Yes. One of the core components of Angular is, one of the core tenets of Angular is don't think about the DOM, think about the data. So if you're thinking about the DOM, you don't have to think about the DOM. Angular insists. And because I'm an Angular expert, I insist as well. I just call myself an expert. Weird. Okay. So moving back to this. Oh, yeah, raised hand.
So sorry to interrupt, but
No, I insist. This is interactive. Thank you for interrupting.
In that case, you only have a very simple object, but if you have like a grid with tons of rows, wouldn't that be, at the very least, not well performant if you add it handlers directly into your markup? Versus using it.
Let's get a little bit further along when we actually start talking about doing repeating, and then we can reference that then. So hold on to that question. I know for those of you who have used Angular in the past, this introduction right here might feel a little bit slow, but I've been teaching this for a long time, and this is designed from hundreds of students the way that we're walking through it right now, specifically so that when you start actually writing this on your own, you won't forget it. Okay. So the astute observer might see something wrong with this. Maybe wrong's not the right word. They might see something curious with this. How do we actually get access to that scope object? What is that scope object? We're just passing this as a variable inside of our constructor function. What is that thing? Angular allows us to do this thing called dependency injection. We're not going to talk about that specifically right now. We will talk about it and also how it works a little bit later. We might get to it after lunch, or we might get to it right before lunch. We'll see. Yes. So there's this mysterious thing going on with Angular in the sense that we're specifically, what we're doing is we're passing in a string to our Angular, to these fun attributes, ngapp, ngController, ngClick. We're passing these things as strings inside of Angular. What this is doing, what we're actually defining inside of there are expressions. Unlike straight HTML, where we can't pass just any functions to get run inside of those inside of our attributes, we pass in strings. Because of that, Angular has this concept of expressions, and expressions are kind of similar to calling JavaScript eval. They're kind of like that. You can kind of think about that. If you haven't used JavaScript eval, load up your console and say, just type eval. I don't know, var name equals Ari. Like that, and then we have this name object called Ari. What that's doing is it's evaluating a JavaScript function as a string. So you can kind of think about expressions as eval in JavaScript land, but they're not really. They're slightly different. So this example right here, why does this keep shrinking on me? This example right here, you can see that we have an expression that simply just does simple arithmetic. We're adding 1 to 2. And we also have another one where we have this click, where when we click on the A tag, although I think in the example I have a button. When we click on the A tag, we're running this expression, and this expression says add 1 to count and save it as count. So it's just like plus equals 1. And you can see as I click on this button, it's running that expression that says count equals count plus 1. So right now count is equal to 15. We click on it, count is equal to 15 plus 1, and we're saving that back to count. It's pretty obvious. One of the major differences between JavaScript eval and Angular expressions is the fact that Angular expressions do not throw exceptions. So if you type, for instance, if you type eval name Ari, I don't know, console log Ari. We type this is going to throw an expression, or it's going to throw an exception, and that exception is called reference error. If we had this on the page, if we have an exception getting thrown on the page, then our application is going to stop. Our web app is going to be like, I'm sorry, you can't do that, and explode. And then if we have one of those errors that happens on the page, or let's say we didn't define something, like I didn't define Ari, that object, that JavaScript object here, if we have that, then our Angular app would appear broken. One of the nice things about this is that we can reference undefined things on the page, which will happen almost every single time that you do an AJAX request. You'll have an undefined value on the page. If we get an exception getting thrown, then our web app would never work. So this is a good thing. The other major difference between expressions and JavaScript eval is the fact that expressions have access to the encapsulated scope that they're on. What I mean by that is in our expressions, for instance, in here, we can reference count. Count will be on the containing scope. So if we say scope.count equals 10, and then we add 1 to that, or we load the page, then it's going to say count doesn't equal 21, it's going to equal to 10. And then we can manipulate that. Hooray, 25. It's a new high. Okay. Oh, that's funny. I had a demo like that. Okay, I need to refresh that, because there we go. So as you can see here, count itself starts out as 0. This right here is an Angular expression. That Angular expression says, show this if and only if the count is equal to 10. There should be 3 equals there, but I only put 2. Mistake. Oh well. So right now the count is 0, so if we add we add 5 to that count is still not equal to 10, so it doesn't show that div. If we add 5 to that count again, then we're going to see that now count equals 10, so Angular is going to show that div. If we add 5 to the count again, then the count is going to be 15, and Angular is going to say, oh, count does not equal 10, so we're not going to show that div. Anyone want to guess what happens if we subtract 5 from the count? Yeah, it's going to show that div. Okay. So now we have expressions. Every single thing that we write inside of those special attributes, inside of those things are called, ready for it? Here's a scary term. Here's a scary term. Directives. Every single time that we use a directive, we're passing that directive an expression. So even when we passed in ng controller equals home controller is evaluated as an expression. Okay. Cool. So we've run through the model and we've run through the controller. Now let's talk about the view. The view inside of Angular is just plain old HTML. We've only written HTML. We haven't written anything specific, anything crazy. We've written HTML. We've also included directives and template binding tags. And so inside of our view, our Angular views include HTML and directives and template binding tags. That's it. Nothing special about it. What? Can you guys hear the screeching tires and the brake and the bullets and the screaming and the explosions? No? Okay. What's a directive? Okay, I'm going to dispel another fear here. Who's afraid of directives? Yeah, if you're afraid of directives, it's okay to admit it. We're all a little fearful of directives. It's okay. The myth of directives is that they are just functions. A directive is simply a function. The only thing a directive is a... It's just a function. It's just a function. It's a function that is run on an element to augment the... what did I say? Its functionality. It's just a function that gets run on an element. Okay? A directive is... It's a function. And what does it do? Yeah, to do what? Yeah, that's right. Okay, guy in the center. In the second to the back row. What's your name? What is it? Manuel. Manuel, what's a directive?
It's a function to augment the functionality of a document.
Yes, that gets run where? On the element. Yeah, so it's all together in the right order. A directive is?
It's a function that runs on the element to augment the functionality.
Yeah, it's awesome. That's it. That's all it is. So in this case, we have a directive here, and this directive, this actually isn't a directive, but we'll talk about that, how we make a directive kind of a little bit. We'll introduce it. But perhaps let's say that this say attribute is a directive. It represents a directive. This directive would run on this div and augment the functionality of this div to call this say function. That's it. Okay. Ready? This is the last time, I promise. It's just a function. Ready? Everyone just repeat after me, okay? We're just going to say this. So even if you don't listen, just read this when everyone else reads it. Okay, ready? A directive is a function. A directive is a function. A directive is a function. Function. That's it. A directive is a function. It's not so scary, right? Not so scary. Okay, it's just a function. And that's a pretty blue, right? I think it's pretty blue. Okay. We've seen a few directives already. Okay. So we've used the ng controller directive. remember, we're passing these expressions so that we're passing an expression to the ng-controller directive that augments the div that we place the ng-controller on that also has the class container. We're augmenting that by saying, hey, run this ng-controller function on this div and pass it the argument home controller, which is an Angular. Yeah, what was your name again? Who said that? Yeah, Rye. Cool. It's an Angular expression. We're just passing an Angular expression. That ng-click directive that we used back there to call the say hello function, that ng-click, when we added that to the button, we simply ran a function that ng-click itself defines that adds the ability for Angular to attach, to grab onto that onClick event and run that function using an Angular expression to call the say hello function that we defined in our page. Got it? So one last time. A directive is that to. Wow, we're playing Mad Libs and everyone just followed along. Hold on, can I get a noun? A directive is a balloon. Okay, I'm sorry. Right. Yes, I totally forgot we had a question.
So
Manuel.
if we reference a different element, is that a bad practice?
What?
If we reference a different element in my function, is that a bad practice?
Rewind. You're referencing an element?
Yes, so let's say a different text.
So, hold on. Ready? Stop! Ah! Don't think about elements, think about data. So Angular insists, and I insist, that you don't think about elements, you think about the data on the page. I want to populate the page with this data. So if you think about it like that, then you can't think about another element. And yes, it's very bad practice. That means bad. I think, right? Anyone know sign language? Okay, that means thank you. Because it's the only one I know. And milk. I know that one. And okay. All right. Okay. So yes. This is just a reminder. This is the reason why I think about attributes and why I think about the HTML as a series of function calls is because simply what we're doing is we're just calling a function on an element. And so if you think about a function just like this, or if you think about that element just like this, this div element might look something more like right? That might be making a little bit more sense now. Maybe not. Okay. So there's a couple, Angular has a bunch of built-in directives already for us. We've seen a few. One of the ones that we've seen is this ng-controller directive. Oh, I'm going to stop saying this weird attribute thing now. I'm just going to use the term directive since we know what it is. Because a directive is simply a function that runs on an element to augment that element's functionality. Just a function. Directive. Okay. The ng-controller directive is used, as we've already seen, to bind a specific controller to the context of that DOM element. So we're giving control of our page. We're giving control over the DOM element and all the sub-DOM element and all the the sub-DOM elements. That's weird. And all the child elements to that controller. If we have a nested controller inside of there, which sometimes we have parent controllers and child controllers, then the directive itself, oh, I forgot to mention, controllers themselves are hierarchical. So you can have controllers, you can have child controllers. And Angular, if something is not found on the child controller element, it will look up to its parent element. I think we have a demo in here. We might. We'll see. Anyway, so the ng-controller is used to attach that specific part of the page to give control of that part of the page to the controller that we're defining it on. So the scope of that specific part of the page is referenced to that controller. Well, I've repeated myself like 3 times, haven't I? I get really excited sometimes. It's kind of an issue. Just kidding. Okay. Oh, here's our demo. Great. So you can see we have in this demo we have. Keep going. So in this demo we have 2 divs, and these divs both are both their own reference on the page. We're using ngController itself here, and we're saying on the first div that we want to give control of an instance of the home controller to that div. In the second div, we're doing the exact same thing. We want to say, in this div, we also want to give an instance of the home controller the control over this div on our page. Excuse me. One thing to note about this demo is that this name references this home controller. This name here references this home controller. So what that tells Angular is that we have the ability to have the instance of that controller. I just said this, I'm sorry, but I will repeat it again. The instance of that controller has control over this part of the page. So this div right here says that name in that div has Ari now set as the name. The second div has Nate now set as the name. It's pretty obvious, right? Okay. ngClick is another directive that we've seen. It's specifically, instead of saying in something like jQuery where you'd be like, you target the element and then you say .on and then you pass in a string that represents the click on click, and then you pass another function. That's a callback function when. Okay. ngClick does something very similar. It says, hey, I'm going to attach to the click element, the on-click element, and runs a function or runs an expression, an Angular expression, when that element is clicked. We've already seen this demo. We've already seen a very similar demo where we have this count. We have a plus and minus, and our count right now is 10 because we only had one controller. In my slides, we only have one controller containing it, so count will propagate all the way through. You can see that we'd simply just add it. We have an ngClick element on this guy, and that ngClick runs, and it defines that method that gets run on it. That changes count. Okay, cool. So we also have the ability to show and hide elements. This is all, again, built-in directives from Angular. We have the ability to show and hide elements based on the result of an expression, an Angular expression. So for instance, in this demo, we have an ngClick on a button, and that ngClick simply flip-flops the state. It says state is whatever state is not now. In our ngShow, ngShow is going to show a div. It's going to unhide a div if the result of that Angular expression is truthy, and it's going to hide it if it's falsy. And I bet you can guess what ngHide does. I'm going to call on someone and ask. Guy in the red shirt next to Manuel? Sorry? Okay. What's your name?
Kieran.
Kieran? Cool name.
I hides the element. The state.
If what?
If the state is false.
Yes, which is the string state is a what?
It's a property of scope.
Yes, and it's specifically calling it there. What is that?
Expression.
Yeah, it's an Angular expression. Yeah, which has access to the scope, which is how it references state. Right.
Is that like changing CSS, like changing the style to be hidden or displayed?
Yes, ngShow and ngHide. So you're asking how do they work?
Yeah.
ngShow or ngHide itself puts a display none important on there. So if you have ngShow and it's falsy, then CSS is going to change and it's going to hide it using display none. and vice versa on ng-hide. There's another div, or there's another directive that we'll talk about, I think we'll talk about it, called ng-if, and that Angular will actually remove an element from the page if it's falsy. So in this case, it's not removing the element, it's staying there, but it's hiding it using CSS. By the way, that CSS is built into Angular, so you don't have to do anything with that. It'll take care of it for you. OK, Kieran, can you repeat what ng-hide does again?
ng-hide hides the element if the expression is set to false.
Awesome. Yep. Cool. So here's our demo. Right. State itself starts out. State itself starts out as undefined, which in JavaScript is considered falsy. So state, when it first starts up, is not true because it's undefined. So ng-hide is going to show it, while ng-show is going to hide. If we click on that and we change it, then the not of undefined becomes true. Because the not of undefined is true, or because true is considered truthy, then ng-show is going to hide it, while ng-hide is going to ng-show is going to show it, while ng-hide is going to hide it. Hooray! And we can click on this a lot, and it still does it. It's still deterministic. It still does the way. What? Okay. Okay. ng model. We've seen ng model before, and we haven't used it yet. ng model, the directive itself binds the value of an element to a JavaScript variable. So what that means, we'll mostly use ng model on inputs and custom directives because we can change the value of those elements. So ng model on an input field, when you start typing things in, it's going. ng model says, "Oh, cool! I have a new value. I'm going to pass in this new value to the JavaScript value of the result of the expression." So in this case, in this input field, we are setting the value of that input field to name, the property of scope called name. That property of scope called name in the template binding tags is then resolved to the thing that we've already started typing. Yes, I know. Oh, one sec. We've started typing, and so the H1 is going to change. That's how that worked in about an hour ago. Yes?
When does it do the binding? I mean, does it do on the change event or it's in the key of event or something like that? When does it actually?
Oh, you're asking when the actual value changes?
Yep, so if you're typing an input or something like that, right? So
Yep.
when does that attribute that value actually gets appended or binds to that?
Right, so by default, every single time that you do a key up, if there's an ng model on it, then it will run what's called a digest loop, and that digest loop will set the new value during the digest loop. You can change that if you want in the latest version of Angular, the pre 1.3, you can change that. You can also change it in before that if you want to, for performance reasons, I imagine, which is what you're asking. You can change it if you want to, but it happens on every keystroke up. All of a sudden I start doing this when I talk about keystrokes. I just can't control it. Okay, so using that knowledge now, hoodie. Person with the hoodie right in front of me. No, not you. Wait, two rows back. I'll ask you in a minute. What's your name? Yeah.
Davey.
Davey? Okay, Davey, how does this work? Yep. So this is the code, right? And so when I start typing, and we have ng model on this thing, right? Is that how you spell your name?
Davey.
Is that right? Okay. Okay, so this has the directive ng model, right? So ng model is doing what when I type in that field? So what does ngModel do? Anyone want to help him out? David?
Binds the value of the field.
Tell David.
Binds the value of the field to the variable.
So what does it do? It's right there. It's right there. Yeah, so it binds the value of that DOM element to the JavaScript variable called name. Okay. To one we haven't seen yet. ngRepeat. So ngRepeat is it's a directive that's used to iterate over a collection of objects. So that's either an array. It's either an array or an object with key value pairs. And it copies the element. It copies the element on the page for every single item in that array. So for instance, in this table here, we have this. I can point to it using my mouse. In this table here, we have a tr, which is, if you, I don't need to explain a tr, right? It's a table row. Okay. So we have this table row, and this table row uses the directive ngRepeat. And so if we have a collection of people, we're going to iterate over that collection of people, and this collection itself is an array with objects in it, like this. It's going to iterate over that, and it's going to create a new tr for every single object inside of that array. And inside of every single one of those TRs, we can reference a local variable called person. And so every single time that we iterate, we're going to say, okay, I'm going to iterate over here, and I'm going to say, in the first TD, we're going to put person.name. In the second one, we're going to put person.email. And scope.people might look something like this, where you have a collection of people, and you have my name and Nate's name, and my email and Nate's email. And in Angular, that's going to render like that. There's a couple different Angular expressions. This is one of the Angular expressions. This is the most popular Angular expression that we use. Or like the most basic, not popular. That's silly. Although it probably is the most popular because it is the most basic. But, you know, a cat might look like a cat, but it might be a dog, even though it looks like a cat. What did I just say? I don't know. Forget what I just said and go back to this. Okay. We're going to use ngRepeat later today. And you may ask me a question.
So the table headings, if you wanted to use the keys,
yes.
the hashes, what would you write in there?
You would do the exact same thing with the exception of you would add as. We'll do a demo at the end of the day. I'll show you. I want to get to dependency injection before lunch. Hope you don't mind. I think that's next. Nope, not yet. Okay, and there's a lot of directives that are built into Angular by default. We have this ng-init, ng-cloak, ng-view, ng-class, ng-style, ng-if, as I mentioned before, ng-include, ng-ninja. Nope, just made that one up. Okay. It's also incredibly easy. Angular makes it incredibly easy to build our own custom directives as well. For instance, let's say that we have a checkout view in our page that we're building to allow people to buy a book. Okay, I'm supposed to reference book as much as I can, so I'm going to say that word a lot. Book, 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 book. Okay, so let's say we have a checkout view, and when someone says, hey, I want to buy this, you add that item to the items array inside of our checkout view. So we might have a bunch of items like this that has the name, the description, the price, image, and other details like that. Say that we want this to be our checkout view, for instance. So in this case, we would have 3 items. We have ngBook, Writing Rails on Angular, and D3 on Angular, and they all have the prices there. It's pretty obvious. In HTML, that might look that is tiny. In HTML, that might look something like this, right? You have a cart, and that cart has a heading, and that cart has a body, and that body has some items, and those items get rendered out like this. So you could do this in your server-side view if you wanted to, which you would probably render if using like PHP. You could write this HTML and then have the PHP elements, right? Oh, it also has a footer and all that fun stuff. You could do that in HTML, and this looks really gross on the page. One thing about, I'm not going to say that, doesn't matter. Anyway, you could take this HTML and you could turn it into something just like that. Ooh, ah. Yeah, we can look at this directive, how it's written here. If you guys want to, we can do that later. Oh yeah, and I mentioned this previously. Angular makes it really easy to make our own custom directives. So we can make that cart directive if we wanted to. More on that later. Okay, cool. Dependency injection, and then break. Because I feel like we're all getting restless. And then code. Okay. So how can we actually call, I previously posed this question before and said we'll get back to it, so now we're getting back to it. So how do we actually call this $scope object? How does this thing get rendered? Because in JavaScript, when you write a function, when you write a constructor function, we're expecting that constructor function to pass in something. We're expecting at the call of that function to get run with something. I just said that. Okay. So this is called, in Angular land, dependency injection. Anytime that we write any code, unless we're writing machine code, arguably assembly code doesn't need dependencies either, depending on how low you go. Anytime that we're writing anything, we are using dependencies. Yes, I don't need to go any further on that. Pretty much all the code that we write, we're using some code that somebody else wrote. So when you're using dependencies, there's only a couple ways that your code can get access, can get a handle on the dependencies that we're calling. One of those ways, for instance, might be you provide a method for your code to look up a dependency. For instance, if you're using like a global object like the window object, you might put your library on the window object, like jQuery does this with a $sign. D3 does this with the D3. It says window.d3 equals. Window.jQuery equals. Window.myLibrary equals. This is looking up imperatively. So if you want to use a function that's written on the window object, or allow our object to look up dependencies, this might be one way that you do that. Our objects are responsible for finding their own dependencies and instantiating them for themselves. So you might say, well, that's cool, that's pretty easy. Yes, and it gets really ugly and really hairy and makes testing really hard. Another way that you can do it is rather than have our own individual variables, our own individual objects look up our dependencies, we can just pass those dependencies to the objects when they're instantiated, when they're created. Angular takes care of this for us. Angular allows us to not worry about looking up dependencies. It allows us to just have them handed blissfully, so we don't have to worry about it. In this case, right here, with our home controller, we are passing in to this function the $scope argument. What we're actually doing here is we're annotating our function. We're saying, because JavaScript itself has no concept of annotations, what we're doing is we're faking annotations with JavaScript. Do you guys know what I mean when I say annotation? We're like adding a note to the compiler. I'm doing hand wavy compiler. Because there's no compiler in JavaScript. It's VM. Anyway, so JavaScript itself may get the concept of annotations in ES6, which might be due out later this year, but that spec is not settled, and there's pushback on getting annotations in there. So for the time being, we have no concept of annotations, which is really unfortunate. but it is what it is. So Angular fakes this. Angular adds annotations to it for us. So what it does in Angular land is it will read this code and say, oh, we have to, when we want it to instantiate this home controller, we're going to pass in the $scope object. This is how we inject all of our dependencies. So anytime that we're using a dependency, we will inject it into the function that we're currently writing, or the object in the way that we'll write it, which we'll see when we get to more complex objects. However, in controllers, we would just add it to the constructor function like this. So in this case, we're injecting the scope object, we're injecting the queue service, and we're injecting the HTTP service, just like this. So how does this work? That might be a question you might ask, right? Would you guys ask that, or should we just skip over?
How does it work?
Yeah, cool, thanks. Interactive. Okay, so the way that it works is using in annotations. If you've used Java, you probably know what annotations are. If you haven't used Java, like I said, it's just adding a note to the compiler. So the way Angular says, okay, I'm going to take this function, I'm going to call toString on that function, I'm going to turn that function into a string. You can see that right here. So for instance, let's say we have a function var f equals function $scope, $q, and I don't know, name service. Right? So we have this function f. It's going to call toString on this function, and using that toString, we get the stringified version of that function. Then it's going to call this crazy regex on there, and it's going to pull those out, and it's going to pull those annotations out and say, oh, cool. What the user asked for to annotate on this controller is the $scope, the $q, and the $HTTP. This is why you have to call it $scope. It's because otherwise the annotation won't work.
So this is Angular module doing this?
This is Angular core doing this. It's actually the injector that's doing it, which you can get a hold of if you want it. We may get a hold of that when we test. Cool. So naming does matter. You have to call it $scope. You can't call it myScope. You can't call it scope. You have to call it $scope. There's one exception to that in the directive, and we'll talk about that when we get there. We may get there. I think we'll get there. So naming does matter. You have to call it $scope. You have to call it $q. You have to call it $HTTP. You have to call it the thing that it's named. Yes?
So why is naming service different? In your example, 2 slides back, you define all the services. You don't have $.
Oh, when I did it here in the example, right here, that was just showing. That's just showing an example in code. I mean, I could change that too.
Internal Angular modules are prefixed with a $, right?
Yes. Yes.
But if you create your own service called name service, you can inject it that way as well.
Exactly. So I'm just showing that as an example of calling toString and then running that crazy regex on it. So in that case, I'd have to call my name service. Otherwise, it would be like, well, WTF, mate? I can't find the name service. Hey? I don't have an Australian accent. I'm sorry. It's terrible. But it's very nice earth. Yes. No, that's Manuel.
No, Roy.
What was it again?
Roy.
Roy. I didn't get that before.
Didn't ask, so.
No, it was. You're right. I'm a jerk.
So, okay.
Okay, Roy.
What about minimizing the code? Would that affect?
What?
Minimizing the code.
One sec. One slide away. Also, order doesn't matter because Angular is going to parse that for us. So order doesn't matter, but naming does. Huzzah! One slide. Okay. Okay, so minifiers, the job of a minifier is to, if you're not familiar, the job of a minifier is to take the code and strip out as much unnecessary characters as possible. A good minifier will strip out comments and all that. I mean, all minifiers strip out comments, but, right. Minifiers also will change variable names, to be as small as they possibly can, so that there's the less amount of bytes that get transmitted over the wire. And this is good because if you're using a mobile app and you're on 3G or 2G, if you even have a G, it's going to be you want to send as few bytes over the wire as possible. So minifier will take our home controller and it will change our home controller to be something like that. But what the? Izzy, I don't know. I can't find it. Okay. Angular provides a way for us to do this. Angular allows a minification syntax. This minification syntax, rather than just passing in the function, rather than us having Angular itself do the annotation for us automatically, we can annotate the function itself. And this is how minification works, because Angular minifiers will not minify strings. As you saw here, it doesn't minify my app, it doesn't minify home controller, but it does minify the variable. So if we want to minify our code, which we all should be minifying our code in production, you have to use this syntax. There are some tools that are available to allow for us to just write those functions, because writing minification syntax can be kind of cumbersome. ngmin is one of those, which, is written by Brian Ford, who's on the Angular team. There's also a new one called Angular Injector, and Angular Injector is just a lot smarter than ngmin, but it requires a little bit of hacking. Not really. It just requires us in our view to change some things around. Whichever one you want to use, if you want to write your own, if you want to write your Angular app so that minification syntax is built in, that's cool too. Okay, lastly, before we go on a short break, when we defined our setter version of the module, we passed in this empty array. You guys remember that? Go back and look at our app.js. See that right here. We passed in this empty array. This empty array is a list of dependencies on a modular level. So we will pass in all of our module level dependencies using Angular module like that. When we get a little bit further, we'll be creating separate modules, and we'll be using that as well. Okay, cool. Now is the time for a good logical break.